It's common knowledge in pop culture today that Castlevania is a series about Dracula. But consider that thought more deeply. The fact that in the 1980s, a Japanese game company made a video game about fighting a character from English literature. It's such a strange decision, one we all overlook. Why did Dracula become a staple of the Castlevania series? Why does he keep coming back again and again, as enemy and protagonist, as rival and father, as the eternal shadow of humankind? What is it about a character created by an Irish writer in the late 1800s that made him so popular in Japan? To understand it, we have to travel back to the first appearance of the vampire on Japanese shores. Most cultures the world over have some variation on the vampire myth. Academically, the myth is defined as having three features. They are stories centered on monsters who survive off a human liquid, most commonly blood, breast milk, or sexual fluids. They are incapable of coming out during the day and hunt at night, and they are some form of dead or undead human risen from the grave. Japan doesn't have anything that exactly fits this narrative. Similar stories of humans as prey in Japan are focused on animal spirits or vengeful ghosts. While ghosts are human dead, what makes a creature a ghost rather than a vampire is the reason for their return. Ghosts rise again due to powerful emotions. Vampires are driven by a physical hunger. The vampire mythos likely made its way to the islands with Christian missionaries who began appearing as far back as the 1500s. The Europeans who came to live in Japan brought with them their religion and their folktales, which included stories of the dead rising to feast on the living. But the mythos would not penetrate popular culture until much later, more than half a century after the Dracula novel first debuted in the West. Why is it that some countries develop these myths and some don't? One prevailing theory is focused upon the way that cultures bury their dead. In Europe, where the myths of vampirism have been common and widespread for centuries, dead bodies were buried, though often not right away, or they were buried in above-ground crypts. This meant the bodies were left to rot, often pretty close to the living. Bodies do strange things when they decompose. Gases build up inside the torso, which travel up the throat and out the mouth, activating the vocal cords, creating the illusion that the dead are speaking. Blood rises to the skin, giving it a healthy flush, and the mouth may even start to bleed. An old-timey peasant seeing such a thing is liable to shout "vampire," which did happen multiple times throughout recorded history. Japan, meanwhile, has been cremating their bodies for millennia, meaning that human bodies weren't left around to rot and give rise to strange rumors. It would take the import of a Western story to start the vampire trend in Japan. Majin Dracula. The first translation of Bram Stoker's novel appeared in Japan in 1956. Sort of. It wasn't a full translation, but an abridged one, which appeared in a larger collection of world classics made to make the works more readily available to the Japanese public. The translator was Teiichi Hirai, who would work on the text for another decade, and was also the first to translate Carmilla for Japan. This was the start of a rapidly growing interest in the fantasy and horror genres, especially the new Western stories appearing in Japan for the first time. It would also be, to the extent of my knowledge, the first appearance of a vampire in Japanese fiction. The first full translation of Dracula would come 2 years later in 1958. The book's new translation was worked on by multiple writers and released alongside the first Dracula film to release in Japanese theaters, Hammer Film Productions' Horror of Dracula. It was dubbed in Japanese, making it very accessible.
私にできることなら。
And it wasn't long before it and the book that inspired it became incredibly popular. You find mention of the film throughout Japanese culture. This is the Dracula that the Japanese recognize. It's the Dracula Hideyuki Kikuchi mentions as standing out in his childhood in the postscripts to his own vampiric novels. It's the film mentioned in countless other works of Japanese horror, like the novel series Another. Looking online, you can find countless examples of Japanese people recognizing this film as having had an impact on their childhoods, and often as the inspiration for their interest in Dracula. The popularity of the figure was enough that in Japan, the vampire is not commonly called a vampire. It's far more likely you'll hear them referred to as Draculas. Dracula the book was as popular in Japan as the film for good reason. As a work of fiction, it is designed to appeal to the Japanese spirit. It has many things in common with classic Japanese literature and its popular traditions. It's written in a diary format. It focuses on the clash between changing eras, between the warriors of the old and new age. It has a forbidden romance and monstrous creatures. It has tragedy and a bittersweet ending. All these are features that are prominent in works of Japanese fiction. And Dracula himself embodies a lot of Japan's favorite character tropes. The Castlevania series would come around in the mid-80s, about 20 years after the first Dracula film to appear in Japan. It was followed by many, many more, as well as many other Hammer film productions centered on other monsters. The Mummy, Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera, the Gorgons, science fiction monsters, and many vampires. They all made their way east in this era, and it was these films that would inspire the creators of Castlevania. These creators, likely young people in their 20s or 30s, would have been the first generation of Japanese people to grow up with vampires. Multiple translations of Dracula would be released throughout this decade, and the first major Japanese vampiric works, such as Hideyuki Kikuchi's Vampire Hunter D, would begin publishing in the 80s. The team behind Castlevania knew one thing to start with. They wanted to make a game about Draculas. Remember, this is Draculas in the Japanese sense. They wanted to make a game about vampires, so they decided to focus upon the most famous Dracula of all. The series found its dark heart and its greatest inspiration in Bram Stoker's monstrous Count. In Japan, he would lend his name to the title, Akumajo Dracula, translated as Devil Castle Dracula, a title that was deemed too satanic for the Western market, a culture that was in the grips of the satanic panic. The person credited with creating the Castlevania series is Hitoshi Akamatsu, a fan of movies in general and Hammer films in particular. It would be he that came up with the whip as a weapon, inspired by Raiders of the Lost Ark, and many of the monsters and bosses of the games would come from Hammer films. The game would be immensely popular and create a series of its own, with each title focused upon a singular theme, the exploration of a castle and a confrontation with Dracula. While many things would change, more would stay the same. The gothic themes and motifs would become far more plentiful as graphics improved. The melodrama and horror elements would increase over time. Dracula would return again and again. The most famous game is definitely 1997's Symphony of the Night, which found players taking on the role of Dracula's half-human son, Alucard. He's not the only Alucard in Japanese fiction. Only a few months later, the manga series Hellsing would debut with an Alucard who is actually Dracula, taking on a new name. Other titles would find players playing as Dracula himself in one form or another. And titles that portrayed Dracula as the enemy still characterized him not as a caricature of evil, but as a complex figure, a shadow of humanity destined to exist so long as evil is in the world. He's given a sense of depth and horror to him in what amounts to very short scenes of the games that few Western works have managed in much larger adaptations. Outside of the classic standouts like Bram Stoker's Dracula and the early Anne Rice novels, Western versions of the vampire over the years have become stale. Japan, meanwhile, does a lot with a little in stories like Castlevania. It's fascinating when you consider how different this Dracula is to the canonical version. For one, he's married to a human and has a kid. The canonical Dracula never gets the girl and certainly doesn't have a family. He's implied to be killed at the end of the novel, though Japanese continuations always make it clear he survived and is very hard to kill for good. Hellsing shows a Dracula that survives outright decimation. Vampire Hunter D implies the ancestor of all vampires is essentially beyond death. And Castlevania presents a Dracula who cannot die for good. He is a constant of the universe, a dark star in the sky humanity will never escape. But why? Why is Dracula so well liked? And why are Japanese interpretations of him so universally similar? The ultimate dark being, a creature beyond death, yet one who loves and creates life, who has a son in both Castlevania and Vampire Hunter D, who respects and even admires humankind while also reveling in destruction and chaos. Why does he keep coming back? The novel Dracula is the story of a warrior who speaks like a scholar and a poet. He's being left behind by a world that is moving too fast. His glory days are behind him and a tragic end stands before him. That description could match half the samurai in Japanese fiction, as the tragic warrior poet is one of Japan's fictional ideals. The nation's most ancient written texts include many warriors who stop to recite poetic lines and comment on the scenery of the world around them before facing their enemy in bloody combat. In the early 1200s, a terrible civil war tore the nation apart on a scale the island had never seen before. It would inspire many works of Japanese fiction, based upon people and events from the time, and created a genre of war stories that would continue for centuries. In later years, the shift towards modernization during the Meiji Restoration saw the samurai losing their place in society, finding themselves useless in the modern world, their values and talents unnecessary. In Japanese fiction, the image of the warrior is inevitably tied to tragedy, to a sense of loss, to a feeling of being left behind by the world. These warriors recite poetry and lament the changing world they cannot escape, while bravely facing their enemy and dying for what they value. From the tale of the Heike to the 47 Ronin, Japanese warrior tales are inevitably about the tragedy, the isolation, the warrior's honor and poetic soul, his suffering as he clings to the way of the blade. Dracula is exactly that type of character, a cunning, intelligent, and powerful warrior, the relic of a bygone age, the symbol of the past who cannot adapt to the future, and that inability to adapt is what leads to his downfall. And yet he survives. Sorrow and the recognition of the constant changing world is a major feature of Japanese literature, and much of Dracula's pathos comes from that theme. The novel is the story of a changing world, a Victorian England where Mina discusses women joining the workforce and learns to write on a typewriter, where Seward is a doctor studying new modern techniques for healthcare, and Dracula himself aims to move to England because of the shifting tides of civilization and power which have left his home nation behind. The Japanese spirit that exists in Dracula is nowhere better presented than in Hideyuki Kikuchi's novel, The Tale of Meiji Dracula, a standalone work that reimagines the Dracula novel in Meiji-era Japan. The story of a young samurai with tuberculosis who is watching the world move on without him. The days of the samurai are over, and his own days are numbered. It is too late for him to live in this world. He meets Dracula, who is impressed with his skill and the strength of his spirit. He too is a relic of the old ways, a warrior from another era, and is deeply attached to the young samurai. The novel ends with Dracula offering the young man a choice: to join him in eternity, to suffer the hunger and darkness, and wander as forgotten warriors together forever. Kikuchi leaves the ending ambiguous. We don't know what the samurai chooses. but I think we know what we want him to choose. What the Japanese fan might hope he chooses, because it seems time and time again that Japan will always choose Dracula.